This podcast is brought to you by the Association for Coaching, the world's leading international professional body which is advancing coaching in business and society worldwide. I'm your host, Maxine Bell, podcast manager for the AC, and I'm delighted to bring you this introductory series exploring mental health in coaching, aimed at both coaches and supervisors. I will be talking to coaches, supervisors and experts in this field to inspire and inform you towards better supporting your clients, as well as taking care of your own mental health and well-being. You will gain invaluable insights and practical tips, both for your professional and personal development, to help you coach better, building resilience and understanding in a stressful world. We will be discussing sensitive topics, so do take care of yourself and ask for help from a friend, colleague or professional if you need it. We will be providing a list of helpful resources and contact numbers on our webpage and in the show notes on the podcast channels, but do check your local area for help. Though informative, this podcast does not replace professional help or training. My guest today is Kate Brassington. Kate Brassington is a trauma-informed executive coach. She has an MSc with distinction in applied positive psychology and coaching psychology, as well as many other qualifications, such as adult trauma-sensitive mindfulness, internal family systems-inspired coaching, and is a mental health first aider, certified Havening's technique practitioner, and a certified meaning and purpose practitioner. Kate has also published research in the Journal of Positive Psychology on the topic of Can Resilience Training Improve Wellbeing for People in High-Risk Occupations? A systemic review through a multidimensional lens. And I want to mention some of your background too, Kate, as it's relevant to our conversation. But you were one of the first women to complete the Common Commissioning course at the Royal Military Academy in Sandhurst. And you served for 9 years, including a tour of Iraq, before you moved into HR and coaching. So, Kate, I'm curious. Welcome, by the way.
Hi, everybody. I'm really happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Just because I've mentioned Iraq, is that where you experienced trauma?
It's a funny thing that people often think that I might have been, but I was very fortunate not to experience, certainly not an event trauma. And I think that right off the bat, it's really useful to just talk about what is trauma. And what it is not, because there's a lot of misconceptions around the word. So the definition that I use is that it's not what happens to you, it's what happens inside of you as a result. So it could be exposure in an event, or it could be multiple exposures over a long period of time, such as childhood abuse or bullying. So it's not necessarily a single event. So when I laugh, as I often do, and say, oh, no, I didn't experience trauma while I was serving. Clearly, I was exposed to some traumatic experiences, and it was I was in Iraq at the very early stages of the war, so things were extremely difficult for the British military then. It's just that I don't think of it as anything particular happened to me, which is often how even my clients that I work with who have experienced something directly happen to them, they still don't often think of it as, oh, that happened to me. That was a trauma that happened to me. But I did experience event trauma when I gave birth to our first child. And so that is actually the trauma event in my life that then so a few years later, I then trained to become a coach, and I'm doing all this psychology and stuff like that, and beginning to work with clients. And that's when people found their way to me, and they were resonating with my story. They were resonating with how I talked about recovering from mental injury. And so that was actually the pathway in.
Oh, that's really interesting. Yes, because people would presume that because you've done that operational duty, that's the place where it happened. And I'm sure that some of the listeners will be surprised to hear you say that it was actually the birth of your child where you got trauma. Now, I was a midwife, and unfortunately that does happen, and I have seen that happen. So I'm sorry that happened to you. But obviously that's informed where you've gone in a coaching direction.
Yes, I think I just got very interested, although I was doing the master's in positive psychology and coaching psychology, and that's another field that can be often misunderstood because you think it's all about positive, happy thinking and that kind of stuff, but it's really not. It's about how do people flourish even in the dark times of life. so I got really curious to learn what is the operating system inside the human that responds to safety or to danger or to threat? What is it within us? And I've done a lot of additional trainings and learnings all around polyvagal theory, internal family systems theory. Like, I'm really interested in how do we respond? One of the earlier trainings that I did, like a million years ago, was as a couple counselor. And I was really interested then in the dynamic of people bouncing back after adversity. How do people work together? Attachment theory is very big in the field of couple counselling, and so that's also a theory which is built around concepts of response to perceived threat. So a lot of these threads sort of come together in my life and my work as I really begin to get very interested, not so much in simply being trauma informed, but more deeply understanding what is it that we call trauma, where does it occur in the body and the mind and the soul, and how does that work together? How does that inform my work as a coach? Because of course the most sort of like heads up display about it all is, what? I thought that coaches didn't work with trauma. And that's often a thing that people, I have to start at that place, especially when I'm, talking to other coaches, because it is true. We don't work with trauma, it's not our remit. It's not what we're trained to do, and it's outside our ethical boundary. So how come I even got the word in there? And so how I describe it is that I think of it more like therapists work on the trauma, whereas I help someone live with it, work with it. And so it is a huge part of that person's life, and it doesn't get excluded from the work. That's kind of how I sort of hold it in my work and what I mean by a trauma-informed coach. But trauma-informed itself is like becoming a bit of a movement. It's becoming a bit of a thing. There's trauma-informed healthcare, trauma-informed education, trauma-informed approaches. And I really welcome that, because one of the key tenets of that is who is doing the informing. And it's often because people who've experienced trauma in all its many different guises are often spoken for. They're a community of people, if you like, or a group of people who don't get to use their own voice. And so that, to me, is a fundamental aspect of it, is who's doing the informing. And the voice of my client in my work is absolutely critical. It's fundamental to the work that I do. And a lot of clients would describe to me their experiences of engaging with the medical system, with therapy, other types of support, where they experience being assessed or diagnosed, or so like this critical kind of person is looking at them, trying to work out if what they're saying is true, to what extent. There's this sense that they're having to describe over and over again what's happened to them and how they feel about it. And I really encourage people that are coming to work with me that they've got the freedom to move beyond that, to move away from that. That I just hold it that trauma is all around us. It's in society, it's in most people in some form, and that they don't need to be convincing me because I'm not making an assessment of them. And that lifts a huge pressure, a huge weight off them, and it allows them to just simply, in their own words, inform me so that we can then coach together.
Yeah, that's a really important point you've made there. This feeling of having to convince a medical professional or somebody that they've got trauma, when even the fact that you're there often is an indication that something you have. Because I do agree with you that most people have some degree of trauma somewhere. And I've heard, I know this Gabor Mate, who is doing a lot for getting trauma out there, isn't he, in conversations, said, or it might have been him or somebody else, said that trauma as well, particularly in children, is not so much the events, but being alone in those events, and then that's when that thing happens inside you. What do you say to that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I'm like many people in this field, I love so much of Gabor Mate's work. Funnily enough, I don't find his books that easy to read, which actually a lot of clients say that to me too. Like, I've got one of the books, but I haven't managed to read it. But I do listen to him a lot on YouTube, and when he's on podcasts and stuff like that. I've watched the movie that they made called The Wisdom of Trauma. And I think he's just really in his element there, just watching him connect at a very deep level with people, of helping them. He's right there with them. So he's not doing a diagnosis. He's talking to a group of women, and some of them are saying, oh, well, yeah, I did have, wasn't that great a childhood. And he just encourages this woman to open up a little bit more. And she's just suddenly sitting there going, oh, yes, that was it. And he goes, there, right there. That's the trauma. And I learned so much from just looking at that and watching that, not because I need to necessarily do that with clients, but I can just hold that space. But I'd like to say a little bit more about, so why do I think that, or why do I say that trauma is all around us? Why is it in our coaching rooms already? And we're all being told, we all coaches, this huge homogenous blob of people worldwide. Okay, so I know that not everyone's the same, right? But why is trauma in our coaching rooms already? And it's the World Health Organization did a massive study in 2016 where they looked at the trauma exposure. So this is trauma exposure again, and we've already talked about the difference between trauma exposure and what actual trauma experience or response in the body. So just trauma exposure is 7 adults out of 10 worldwide were thought by this huge World Health Organization study to have been exposed to trauma. And if you then look at those kind of meta statistics and think what a percentage of people worldwide are then getting diagnosis of something like PTSD or some kind of mental health condition that's leading them to get more support. And that's thought to be around 9%. So to me, that leaves a huge delta of people. So the ones who've got a diagnosis of something like PTSD or whatever are less likely to show up in our coaching rooms for sure. But we've got a lot of people worldwide who simply don't even get access to that kind of diagnostic support, who and particularly with things like childhood trauma, long-term chronic trauma exposure, and people who are first responders, we're just not really, the frameworks that exist, if you like, within coaching aren't enough to help us understand. And so this is what I keep banging the drum about. It's to be trauma informed is to understand that it could be in any of the people that you're working with. And the magic of it is that you don't need to know that or diagnose it. There are some things that you can do that make your practice trauma informed. That means that'll make it safer and better for everyone. One of the key definitions of trauma informed practice, and that's particularly coming from in the NHS or work in health and care sector, is that we're trying to reduce the impact of negative trauma experiences that might have happened in someone's past, and trying not to re-trigger them inadvertently, and also trying to be supportive. So supportive for good physical and mental health. And when we are looking at it through that lens, we're much more able to understand that we can be coaching someone in a trauma-informed way that is not working on the trauma.
Just because some of the listeners here this may be a new topic for them. It might be something they've been avoiding, or it's just something new that they've come. You talked about PTSD and you've talked about childhood trauma, which sometimes is called complex trauma, isn't it? And sometimes childhood development trauma. Certainly for myself, I read Bessel van der Kolk's book a few years ago. I've forgotten the name of it now. The body keeps the score. The body keeps the score.
Yeah.
Now, that changed everything for me personally about understanding myself when I read that book. And it's a book I recommend everyone to read. But can you just differentiate a little bit between what you mean by PTSD and when you talk about complex PTSD, what the difference is, or if there is a difference? Or
Gosh, yeah. And I mean, straight away, I would say, I'm not a psychiatrist, and I'm not someone who's versed in these terms as for the full diagnostic definitions, if you like. However, I've done a lot of reading, learning and understanding of them. One of the things I've just finished actually, but I done a lot of work as an expert witness, where I would have read a lot of psychiatric reports on people who've been injured in work, and I'm writing employability reports for them. So it's very interesting that I've been able to pick up a lot of understanding about how the diagnostic manual, which is known as DSM-5, Diagnostic Statistical Manual 5, has developed over the years. And some of the listeners may be familiar with some of the, the academic critique that goes on around this massive document, because it's super useful when you're looking at through a medical model that must know what it is that's wrong with someone so that the right treatment can be authorized and paid for. So as you can guess from that, it's predominantly very vibrant in the States and in countries where the medical system is paid for through an insurance model. It's less vibrant in the UK, but it still matters when you're talking about enacting employment law or health and safety at work, or as well as treatment. So it's not just for doctors to know how to treat someone or how to diagnose and treat someone, but it does actually come with a lot of this associated baggage. So these words have meaning often in law. So when I'm talking with someone and they like people, and they flip from that to like how people themselves, like real people in our coaching rooms, describe themselves. They say, oh, I've got PTSD. Now, I might ask some questions. Oh, was that a formal diagnosis? Who gave you that diagnosis? Where did that come from? Not everyone has access to psychiatrists and has been given literally that advantage in a way of having that level of healthcare. Sometimes it's just actually more of a self-diagnosis. So I hold that, and I talk about it quite a lot in my research paper, like even the whole wording of the medical model is often very negative. So like the disorder word at the end of it. So it's post-traumatic stress disorder. And often with my clients and in myself, I actually drop the D, which is there's a movement online called Drop the D, and it's just like post-traumatic stress is a natural response that happens within people, within their nervous system. It's a natural response to events that are way beyond the normal range. So that's what I would understand. Now, from what I understand, you can have a diagnosis of PTSD for a number of ways, and the doctor will be almost following a flow chart and looking for key things to be key conditions to be met in order that they can give that diagnosis. It gets more complicated with complex PTSD, which is exactly what you're saying, CPTSD, which is a condition that, because some of the traditional definitions of PTSD require there to have been a specific event. But when you've got someone with long-term chronic low-level exposure, such as certain types of child abuse or bullying, or like I was saying with first responders, there may not be a one event. It may be a kind of snowball of multiple events. Abuse in relationships is another very classic example. And again, this CPTSD is focusing on what it is that happened to you, as PTSD diagnosis does as well. So even these two sort of outcomes of the medical model are really focusing on what is it that happened to you, which comes from the medical model of, oh, I fell off my horse and broke my leg. That's what happened to you. It makes sense to the doctor then as to what kind of break. Do you know what I mean? So it's very interesting that we've this kind of pattern is followed across into mental health. Anyway, so PTSD and CPTSD, I find that when I working with people who may have a formal diagnosis or just simply maybe have an awareness in themselves that they're more likely to have experienced the complex or chronic trauma exposure, is I'm curious with them how it shows up in daily life, which is exactly how we do it with when you're trauma-informed coaching with anybody, whether they've got a diagnosis or not. What you're interested in is what's showing up every day, what's showing up in daily life, because a therapist is interested in what happened in the past. But as a coach, we're interested in what is happening now and what is it that you want to have happen, which of course is your traditional, you're working towards a goal, what is it you want to achieve, what changes do you want to make in your life. And often when I'm working with someone who's experienced explicit trauma of some kind, and they say to me, oh, what shows up in daily life will be something along the lines of the nervous system responses. So there'll be anger or rage, there'll be fight, there'll be flight, there'll be freeze of some kind or shutdown or submission. And I start from that place really, rather than trying myself to head off into medical terminology and into diagnostic terms like PTSD or anything like that. I tend to let the client bring those words if they feel relevant to them. But I am just holding my knowledge and understanding of it all lightly, whilst asking the client, what is happening in your daily life? What is not working for you right now? A common way that people will describe it is a kind of stuckness. And often in the whole coaching community is, we all help people with stuckness, But how does that really show up? What kind of stuckness? What situations are they feeling stuck in? When were these feelings of stuckness, have they experienced them in previous parts of their life, previous earlier times in life? So I'm interested in the past as it informs the present. Again, but I'm not trying to take the client back there in order to therapy them.
Yeah, there's so much in everything you've just said. Because one of the questions I had was, why is it important for coaches to understand what trauma is? But actually, you've kind of answered that with your statistics that you gave, and the fact that you've basically said that it's likely to turn up in the room anyway, whether a client labels it as such or not. I think some coaches are going to feel a bit nervous and a bit hesitant even about asking those questions that you ask, how does it show up, or even just bringing the conversation into trauma in case it becomes therapeutic. So how would a coach set boundaries? How would they need to recontract? How would you sort of give them some tips on what to do in that situation? Or maybe on their own reflections about themselves as a coach and what they think they can or can't do.
Yeah. I think it's such an important question. It's one of the reasons that I've tracked myself more and more towards becoming a fully chartered, which I'm working towards the chartership part, but coaching psychologist, because I really feel that the big wide world of coaching, which is basically, we're like hairdressers, we're unregulated. Anybody can call themselves a coach. Anybody can work in deep psychological connection with other humans without any training. There's nothing regulatory to stop this happening, I think, in pretty much every country in the world. And this is an amazing situation to be in a field like this. So to people listening who are thinking, whoa, all I'm trying to do is help people, like, I really hear you and I really understand that. What I hear a lot in coach training, so for people who've benefited from coach training, and I'm in one myself at the minute, and this exact conversation happened in the training that was on this week. The coach is asking the trainer, but what if trauma arrives in the coaching room? What if there's a shadow or some kind of, what if it becomes apparent? And the teacher just said, well, they wouldn't be in your coaching room anyway, because they would be going to a trauma therapist. And I think this is one of the myths that I really want to debunk. I don't find that clients walk around with a clear label in their own mind or taped on their forehead to explain what it is that they've gone through in life and to put it into this kind of language. They are just looking for help in relationships, in job, in career, and to make areas of life better. They're not in the main, and like we said, the percentages speak for themselves. That's like most people are not going to have a diagnosis tucked into their handbag, ready to talk to you about. So I really debunk that kind of, it's like a fundamental premise of a lot of coach training, which is that we're not going to be working with people who've experienced trauma. And I cannot see the truth in that. I don't think there is a truth in it. So does that put you off coaching? No. In other words, why I talk about this so much with other coaches is I want to encourage and support you that there's many ways that you can become trauma informed and become aware, become sensitive to these kind of issues, the kind of things that even the conversation we just had, like what is PTSD? What is CPTSD? What are adverse childhood experiences? What are, and even to understand so that when this kind of language, if it comes into your coaching room or someone talks about an event, and like events are dead easy, so you're saying, oh, I was at a car crash, or I had a horrible childbirth experience, or, whatever their thing, I've got bullied by my boss 6 years in a row. You can hear in client language that they're telling you about these events. So you can already hold it lightly, that you don't need to be diagnosing anything, but you can stay a little bit curious, like, oh, there could be some trauma response here. And then learning and knowing and informing yourself around what are the trauma responses. Fight, flight, and freeze is the most basic, current one. I mean, these are all working models, right? This is all emerging science, but inform yourself. So when someone says, oh yeah, I shut down, actually, I think I'm a bit depressed. Well, there's another flag. We're told we don't work with people who are depressed. But do you understand the function of depression? Do you understand that it's a kind of protector? Can you hold space for your client to say, yeah, do you know what? It only happens when, I don't know, 3 days off payday and I realize I'm never going to earn any more money, or whatever it is. You're just able to be alongside and to hold space for someone who is then able to look within themselves. But you're not asking questions. You're not going for a diagnosis. You're not saying, oh, gosh, that sounds like PTSD or something like that. I mean, I'm hamming it up slightly. Do you know what I mean? But like, if we're just careful not to re-traumatize, if we're careful to be aware, sensitive and informed, then I think that it can really add huge value to our presence in the coaching room.
Kate, I was just reflecting after what you've just said that it's come up quite commonly that a lot of coaches are quite nervous about asking certain questions, whether that be a question around suicide or about mental health in general. And so there must be a lot of fear and anxiety or lack of confidence. So obviously each of our experiences are different. So that's going to impact how we're ready to tackle this. But have you got any tips or any points you want to say on that issue that about coaches wanting to pretend it's not there or just be too afraid and not know what to say?
I think it's such a great question, because it's kind of easy for me to say, we should understand and recognize that trauma is out there already. But then you're immediately thinking, that's not what I was told in coach school, if I attended any coach school, And then what if the client's dropped some really big issues that are, you just mentioned suicide, either something that they're dealing with in a family member or a loved one, or issues in their workplace, or, really any number of what you might think as slightly, using the red flag terminology, like you are sitting there as a coach going, wait a minute, I know this is not what I'm trained for. And I think that the best training of all the million billion ones that I've done, and you started the intro very kindly listing about half of them, it's like the best one that I did was mental health first aid. That is such a powerful foundation. It's so powerful that actually the Division of Coaching Psychology in the British Psychological Society is including it as a prerequisite, as a requirement for someone. And you just think, oh my goodness, do you think a coaching psychologist, like anyone who's got psychologist in their title, would really need that? And the answer is yes, because it is such first aid for someone, is such an interesting and important area of health that it deserves a whole, like it's a 3-day course in its own right. You go through the material. It's experiential. It's in depth. You're faced with the issues that come up inside yourself when you're dealing with people talking about these issues. So mental health first aid training. I mean, I've always all my life been trained how to do like physical first aid, to the extent that I'm surprised sometimes when if I come across an accident or someone's unwell or something, that people around don't actually know simple things like how to make the casualty safe, how to put them into recovery position, how to take care of things like their airway, are real, to me, obvious basics. If we go and do mental health first aid training, we equip ourselves with these absolute rock solid basics, how to ensure someone is safe in that moment and how to support them as you move them through the next step. It's extremely jarring, and I've experienced it myself as well. It's extremely jarring when you're sitting, having opened up. So you put your feet in the client's shoes, you've spoken to someone, you finally made that step, and then you make some kind of comment and the coach says, hang on a minute, this is outside of what I can work with. Have you thought about therapy? Ooh, it's very jarring. It's almost like rejection. That link between realizing inside yourself as a coach that this person is probably outside of your ethical remit of what you can work with, and how you support them into finding their next right step for them is nuanced. It's a kind of scary place. It's why I think all people working in as coaches should really be having some kind of supervision or some kind of supervisory function of someone they can turn to and say, gosh, this happened today, because you've just listened to a whole pile of things from your client that you're probably not trained to hear or handle in yourself. So there's care of yourself and there's care of your client. And then as you support them to find out what is the next right step for them. And the mental health first aid, I did the mental health first aid England, but there's ones all over the place. It's really important to understand how best to signpost into your area. Just saying, oh, go get an appointment with your GP may be a complete nightmare. You might be better signposting to a charity, or, talking with the client about the different options they've already been through. You know what I mean? You become a companion. You become a guide. You become someone who stays with the client, literally the same way that a first aider would stay with the casualty until the first responders arrive, because in effect you are a first responder. Mm-hmm. You're waiting for the paramedics who are called first responders, but you're just a bystander who's become a first responder. And so you are then really taking care of that person until you've handed them over, or until the client says, no, I'm fine with this now, I've got this, So I think it's really important that coaches are not afraid to be shocked into silence, but afraid as in respectful. Like, these are really big issues, and it's so great when you get that kind of training that really underpins and supports that. I don't know, in the Association for Coaching, you'll know more than me as to whether they recommend people do mental health first aid training. Is that a thing?
I'm not sure, but we have got now a mental health special interest group, and we've just created some mental health guidelines for supervisors, and there's some other work ongoing within that group. So that may come, but I don't think at the moment. So yeah, it's being looked into. Just what you were saying as well was making me think that it is about the client in those moments as well. So there has to be a certain amount of self-awareness in the coach that this topic, if it comes up, is tricky for them. But even when you feel that as a coach, red flag, I want to get out the room, it's not about you in that moment. And I think that sometimes has helped me in the past is, what does this person who's just been very vulnerable potentially in that moment need? And even if you say, I'm not quite sure what to say at the moment, but let's just sit and, carry on talking, or wherever you frame that, like you said, you're being present. So I think you're right. And it's a very good analogy with a physical injury. You wouldn't walk away from someone whose leg was bleeding, would you? And go, sorry, yes, I'm not qualified for that. I'll see you later. You would.
Yeah, I phoned the ambulance. Bye.
Yeah, you'd stay there and attempt to do something, wouldn't you? Even if it was holding their hand.
So stay with them. I've had a lot of conversations, and in fact, on my own podcast, interviewed a mental health first aider, and I just think it's really powerful area of mental health in our communities, in our schools, in our workplaces, in our families, to have more and more people trained in this, in the same way that it has huge benefits when we have people who are trained in physical first aid. You said a really cool thing just then I'd like to go back to, which is taking care of yourself. So this situation has happened, your client has said some things, and you're now moved into mental health first aid role, and you're taking care of them. There is another person there who needs taken care of, and it is you, the coach, the person who's listening. And I think that's a really lovely way that you've really opened that up and acknowledged it. And it's a big part of the mental health first aid training framework as well. It's like, how do you take care of yourself afterwards? Who do you go and talk to? What are the ways that you take care of your stress and your issues? We all talk about self-care in the helping professions, and I think that mainly people really don't know what that is. They really don't fully understand it. It's sort of often paid a bit lip service to, or whatever. So it's something that really, really matters in our practice as a coach, is that for those times when we're going to feel super vulnerable and out of our depth for any reason in the coaching room, especially if it's related to trauma, or your client suddenly says they're autism, or there's something they're dealing with in the family, or there's huge issues that you can stumble across just because they're out there in everyday life. So why would they not be in your coaching room? And I think it's really great when you can take care of yourself in that moment. You mentioned, like, when someone is actually, when the client talks about feeling suicidal, And that takes a whole day in the mental health first aid courses just around suicidality and suicide. And I've had it happen on a number of occasions, and I still get that ice inside of me. I still get that. It is a reaction in me of, oh no, because I'm human, and I know, God, this is the real deal. You have some kind of, your nervous system changes gear because of what's happening in the room. And I just want to say that is okay. You need to be able to take care of that. You've got a huge surge of energy. Your body, your nervous system are responding to the situation as they rightly should. And you need to be able to take yourself down off that and to have the support structures, whether it's a supervisor or a fellow coach, or again, someone who should be able to hear that kind of content. It's someone you're not just you most likely coming out of a conversation like that, mental health first aid conversation, you're not going to talk to the family members that you live with about this. That to me is a big aspect of my work, is who do I offload to? Who do I take care of myself? I'm a trauma-informed coach. It means I get a higher volume of trauma in my practice than perhaps someone who calls himself some other kind of coach. I don't go downstairs and talk to my husband about what I just heard. That's not how it goes. So I think that our support structures for ourselves as coaches it's talked about a lot, but I certainly remember in my coach training, it wasn't really a big deal. And it's something that I think is a much bigger deal now.
Well, Kate, you'll be pleased to hear that the final episode of this series with Anthony Eldridge-Rogers is all about how to coach, how to take care of their own mental health. So,
good. All right.
We're doing it. No, it's good that you bring it up. I think it's something we need to be reminded of. But also we did a podcast episode in 2021 where we interviewed Nadine Robson, and she's a mental health first aider. So if listeners want to go back to previous podcast series, they can listen to somebody who is a mental health first aider talk about that. And as you say, there are so many courses out there for this now, everywhere we go. So yeah, it's a really good point. And the other thing that you mentioned a while ago was that how trauma turns up is not going to necessarily be completely obvious. It's not like, I think people often imagine it turning up with someone who's got maybe some more severe mental illness. There are many of us walking around day to day looking like we're functioning through life, and we've developed a really good cover-up. So you won't be able to tell necessarily, will you, when a client walks in a room whether they've got trauma or not. They might do a very good cover-up for a while, and it might just be one moment where something comes up.
Yeah. I think it's a really good point. And just people don't walk around with that kind of label on their head, or even knowledge inside their head that that's what they're dealing with. And I've worked with some of my clients have, experienced sexual assault. And I'm helping them find their words because they're describing it. And even they are not recognizing that there might be an element of trauma. Or I've worked with people who, amputees in the battlefield. Now they're able to understand that that's a battlefield trauma, but a lot of them will say, "Oh no, but I'm fine. I didn't get a mental injury as well." And you're thinking, well, have you or haven't you? I don't need to know. I don't need to diagnose. But it's like just, so what I'm trying to say is, even if your client is arrived into the room with their label up front because they're sharing it, like, yeah, I've had a load of therapy, I've dealt with my PTSD, and I'm really looking to coach into the next career step in my life. You're making a decision based on the information of the person in front of you, versus what you're saying. You might also have, I would suggest, far more clients who are arriving in going, I'm a bit stressed about this. I'm a bit on edge about that. I'm feeling uncertain. I'm feeling fearful. These are all standard words in everybody's vocabulary. They don't necessarily mean that there was trauma, but you're also aware of how, when you get your trauma-informed awareness teaches you that the nervous system doesn't have different operating models. It only has the ways that it only works in fight, flight, or freeze, or calm and connected. That's it. So if someone is talking about anger, then you're interested in how come their nervous system, what has it been responding to? Has the person stuck in that state, or are they able to move out of it in a kind of, that's like a healthy way? We all experience these points in the nervous system. We all experience fight, flight, and freeze or submission. That's what it's designed for. That's it. It's high functioning. That's us at our high functioning best. So we shouldn't be afraid of the fact that someone said, oh gosh, yes, I got really angry. What we're interested in is, how often does this happen? Are you stuck at this place? Are you living in that area of your nervous system, or are you able to regulate and down-regulate and become co-regulated with the other people around you? So
I was just thinking, I've got a question here that might be a bit provocative, potentially. Do you think that all coaches should be trauma-informed?
Yes, I do. I think that we're doing a massive disservice to people coming into the coaching profession by not helping them even understand some of the basics that I've talked about today. That traumas, that World Health Organization study was 2016, like that's before the pandemic. Things haven't got better since then, let's put it that way. It won't take a huge amount for us to really shift and send this message out across the world of coaching, that there are simple steps that we need to be taking in order to protect our clients, and that we need to be taking in order to protect our coaches.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Protecting the clients and protecting the coaches. Yeah, really strong. Coaching is supposedly about wanting to make a better change for people individually, but also in a wider sense. There's lots of conversations about how coaching can contribute to making the world a better place, which is a very big responsibility. But if you're going to do that, you need to get honest about the nitty gritty, don't you? About the fact there is a lot of trauma out there. There are mental health issues. There are people who the suicide rates are going up, particularly in men, and you can't avoid those, because I have a theory that you can't change what you deny. If coaches go into the step of trying to deny certain things, they're not. It's kind of taking away that potential of being a change maker, or being involved in supporting someone making a change.
Yeah, if I'm understanding you correctly, it's like a trauma-informed world is good for everyone.
Yes, that's what I mean.
Yeah, it's a kinder, better place for everyone. We don't have anything like a more diverse and inclusive world where people can feel safe to belong is a better world for everyone. You don't need to be in a minority group to benefit. You can be human and benefit. And I think this is there's nothing to be afraid of by becoming trauma-informed. It won't work against you in some way. It's only going to actually make the world better.
Yes, yeah. That's a lovely thing to say towards the end. Just before the final question, can you let the listeners know how to get in contact with you, or if they'd like to look you up and find out more?
So I hang out a lot on LinkedIn, and on a bit on Facebook, and a bit on Twitter, which is called X now. That goes to show how much I hang out on there. On my website, so I'll give you all the links for the show notes, but on my website, I also host all the podcast episodes. I've been running my own podcast called Moving Beyond Trauma since the spring, and then through my own client work and the evolution of myself inside of that, I renamed it Refreshing Leadership. And so the podcast Refreshing Leadership we're in full flow of season 2 right now. And I just have the most amazing conversations with super interesting people. And then also I do a lot of solo episodes where I just talk a lot, like what I've been doing with you. I just kind of talk to myself, record it, and then upload it as a podcast. I just think that, there's so much we can do to educate, inform, and inspire people to learn more about this, that, like you were saying earlier, we don't need to be afraid of these topics. It can be embraced, and knowledge gives power, good old Spider-Man stuff, it's really power. And it's a good direction to go. So yeah, please come and continue the conversation with me. To anyone who wants to, as you can tell, I'm quite a geek or a nerd about all of this stuff. And I just welcome having these conversations. I do it all the time.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. Yeah, it's been really lovely. And just before we go, first of all, I want to say that I think that I'm really glad we had this conversation. And I also just want to say to people that this is just the beginning of a conversation on trauma. It's a big topic to look into if you want to, but I think, Kate, you've given some really good pointers in the right direction, and hopefully raised people's curiosity enough to go and look further and consider what steps they might want to take. Have you got any final pearls of wisdom or any final points you'd like to give to listeners before you go?
Often what people ask me next at this point is, okay, so how do I learn more? And I think that that's a super interesting question because there is no blueprint yet. There's no standard way to become a trauma-informed coach. There's a couple of accredited programs with ICF, and I don't know, again with AC and with EMCC, I'm not sure, just like I'm not sure of the other providers out there. I don't have one that I particularly recommend at the moment. A lot of this kind of training is out there in the world of progressive types of trauma. So the somatic people who somatic experiencing, which is the school from Peter Levine, who's like the whole world of how to coach through the body and with the body in mind. That's one. There's the internal family systems, which has got a wonderful coach program. And there's a couple of different coach programs where one in particular, which trains the entire internal family systems model and coaching for people to get accreditation, which I really welcome that because I think there's so much space for that really would protect a coach. That's the program that I wish was around 7 years ago when I started this. That's the one I would do now. And also just picking up trainings, hang out and see what trainings you can get onto. I've had the most amazing trainings on polyvagal theory with Deb Dana herself. That was all a series that came up on lockdown. This training on trauma-sensitive mindfulness through David Treleaven is fantastic. I've trained with Connected Kids, learning how to teach meditation to children, which was brilliant training. And I use a lot of the techniques with my adult clients. I mean, I don't say, this is a kid's meditation technique. I say, hey, should we do some drawing? There's lots of fun ways that when you're connected to what kind of client is finding their way to you and the kind of issues that they're dealing with, it really does begin to inform your own practice, I think, and to kind of lead you forward into what might be the next right steps for trainings for yourself. So one day there'll be a wonderful world where I can say, go and do this XYZ thing, and that will spit you out the other end as a trauma-informed coach. At the minute, that doesn't exist, so go make your own.
Yeah, no, that's really good. You've given plenty of ideas for people to start with there, so that's great. Kate, it's been absolutely wonderful having you on. I'm going to remember what you said about a trauma-informed world is a kinder world.
Thanks for having me. I've just loved it, and good luck, everybody. I look forward to hearing what you thought.
Yeah, thank you ever so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you for listening to another podcast by the Association for Coaching. For over 20 years, our purpose has been to inspire and champion coaching excellence, advance the coaching profession, and make a sustainable difference to individuals, organisations and society. To find out more about the AC and our member benefits, follow us on LinkedIn or visit our page at www.associationforcoaching.com. Explore our new digital learning hub and enjoy our extensive library of on-demand webinars, signature programs, member benefits, interviews, podcasts, and a portfolio of live events featuring thought leadership, tools, models, and the latest industry trends to help you develop and increase your coaching expertise.